Jojo's Part 5 is...
Killer Queen 第3の爆弾バイツァーダスト
So, I kind of changed my mind about what I wanted this video to be, and that sort of messes up most of the footage that I'd already done, but I really liked that opening gag. Instead of going at this from the approach of me tearing into JoJo's Part 5, I'm going to instead talk about adaptation, and some of the reasons why being a faithful adaptation is not necessarily always a good thing. And I will definitely be saying a lot of negative things about JoJo's Part 5 throughout this video, but I'm just saying that I've decided to make that not the main point, because personally I don't think that that's a very valuable or constructive way to go about looking at this, especially whenever it fails in such an interesting way. Oftentimes whenever we talk about adaptation, the desired outcome for most people is something faithful to the original. Most of the complaints that we see levied at adaptations is that they deviate from the original or cut things out, or the characters look wrong or something. We're going to be taking a deep dive, deep under the waters of the seas to figure out why JoJo's Part 5 is actually bad. The character designs look very similar to the ones in the manga. Previous parts didn't really seem to have any qualms with deviating artistically from the manga, but Part 5 decided to stay strangely loyal to the manga, and this is pretty much only a bad thing. JoJo's, more than most other manga, is drawn to be a manga, and what I mean by this is it just doesn't translate very well into animation. The character designs look very nice and detailed and very artistically pleasing to look at whenever viewed in a manga in this drawn format where they don't have to move around, but the second that you have to animate these, they quickly become too complex. And whenever you combine this with the fact that posing characters like they're posed in the manga makes them even more difficult to animate, because they're posed not in such a way that allows them to move properly, but in whichever way was the most aesthetically pleasing to look at on the page. All this combines to make characters that animate very poorly. And I'm also going to add this little detail that sort of stuck out to me, that the characters and the backgrounds look really different, like they belong in entirely different universes. These characters have thick black outlines, and the backgrounds have pretty much no line art at all. So the characters look like they exist on an entirely different plane of existence from the background, and that's bad probably, but moving on. While the art style is probably the most immediately noticeable aspect that sticks too closely to the manga, I think another issue in adapting Part 5 in particular is that the part simply isn't paced very well to fit within an anime. Manga aren't paced the same way as anime. They're just way faster to read. You can get through a volume, particularly of a series like JoJo's, in like less than half an hour pretty easily, and in just a couple of sittings you'll have finished Golden Wind. And one thing that you'll notice if you look at Golden Wind as compared to other parts is that it doesn't fucking stop. It just keeps going. You start, and it's sort of, for the first few episodes, the first few volumes, it's kind of slow. The arcs are a little bit more mystery based, But once it gets to the point where you're dealing with La Squadra, the part picks up and basically doesn't stop until the very end. Every fight is this action suspense battle for their lives, where they're outwitting each other in all of these creative and fun ways that are pretty enjoyable whenever you're reading it pretty quickly through. But in the anime, you begin to realize that this all feels the same. Every fight is the same as the previous one. None of them strive to evoke different tones or atmospheres, but I would be lying if I said that I didn't think the primary factor was the fact that you can't speed read an anime. You can't go through the show very quickly. There's a set amount of time it has to take up. I think that because of that, and the lack of variety in tones, like how stand battles in previous parts 3 and 4, varied quite a bit from fight to fight. Some of them were outright comedy, some of them were very much based on mystery, and some of them were pretty much entirely horror, and some of them were suspense action. But there was a pretty good mix in the previous 2 parts, and really I think that the problem is mainly one that's unique to part 5 and the type of story that Araki chose to tell. Granted, I don't know exactly how the anime would go about fixing this, other than by shortening some encounters or taking some encounters out entirely. Like Babyface, the worst fucking stand fight in the whole part because it really sucks. One thing that I hear people praise the anime for a lot is the additional material that it adds. And that's fine, I guess, but I have a few problems with that material, actually. Obviously, they add a backstory to Fugo. My main issue with it is just that it wasn't very interesting to me at all. But, that's, I guess, just my opinion. Maybe there's some sort of deeper thematic purpose to it, but it felt kind of hollow to me. But again, that's really just me. It could be a total me problem, and maybe everybody else thinks it's fantastic. But the other thing that I have a little bit of an issue with is actually the stuff that they added with La Squadra. And I know that people really like La Squadra. I think La Squadra's pretty alright, mostly just because of Prosciutto and Pesci, but I get the appeal. And I also understand why it's kind of cool to see the gang together, but that sort of draws attention to something that I think I'd always sort of thought about with La Squadra. In the manga, it's not very dwelled upon, the fact that Sorbet and Gelato are murdered by Chocolata, but in the anime, a lot of attention is given to it. The members of La Squadra mourn for their friends, and you're sort of given the impression in the show that their primary motivation isn't just to supplant the boss, isn't just monetary gain, but to avenge their friends that were murdered. And this sort of introduces a moral complexity that I don't think existed in the manga. In the manga, I don't really think that there was this connection established between the members of La Squadra beyond specific pairs like Prosciutto and Pesci, and the idea that Risotto vaguely cared about the people working for him. But in the anime, this becomes impossible to ignore, and it begs the question, the gang is doing something morally a little bit questionable here. Like, the boss murdered their friend, and they want to get the boss back. Not necessarily by murdering his daughter. They want to use her to find him. So I kind of wonder, why is that never addressed? Not that they should have worked together or anything. I think that the people in La Squadra are still reasonably bad guys. But there's enough in common between them and the gang and their goals that you'd figure it would have been addressed at least once. I don't know, it just built that expectation up in me for some reason. But I guess that's fine. I also want to mention my favorite moment from the anime because I've never seen anybody else draw attention to it, and it's in the Formaggio fight, which is probably already kind of surprising, but Narnancia summons his stand, and Formaggio looks at it and he's like, oh shit, and he leans back and he rolls up the fucking car window, and that made me laugh, like, out loud the first time that I saw it. Buddy, that's not gonna work. I just think that there are some questions here about what makes a good adaptation. I don't think expanding on the source material is inherently a valuable thing. I think if they included Shameless Purple Haze, that would be good, because Shameless Purple Haze is good, but I don't think just adding additional content to flesh out the world for the hell of it is necessarily a good idea. And maybe faithfully adapting things isn't always the best way to adapt them, especially whenever you're changing from one medium to another. But I don't know, man.